Salve! Welcome back to Weekly Roman History. The content warning for today's video is suicide. It's brief and near the end, and I'll warn you with the title. Today, we're going to destabilize the Roman Republic. The oligarchy that rules the Republic is at the height of its power at the end of the Second Punic War. It won't last. The fabric of the Republic is forced to change due to military overreach and increasing wealth. Here's our roadmap. Rome adds a lot of new land, putting stresses on its political system, which must add new office holders to govern it all. They also begin to exploit their provinces economically, infusing huge amounts of wealth into the nobility. This causes internal issues. Hellenization changes the lifestyles of the upper class, and widening wealth inequality disenfranchises the smallholding farmers who used to form the backbone of Rome. All this leads to new conflict between the ruling oligarchy and the common people, between optimates and populares, a sort of second conflict of the orders that crystallizes in a pair of brothers called the Gracchi. In response to the Gracchi, the oligarchy injects an unprecedented level of violence into politics, escalating political disputes into mob warfare in the streets of Rome. And that's how Rome goes from a functioning oligarchy to a disorganized mess primed for the civil wars that will mark the next era. Okay, into the nitty-gritty. The Second Punic War gives Rome two new provinces, Spain and North Africa. The first provinces were gained in the First Punic War, Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. Provinces are different from the Italian allies, the first conquests of Rome. Provinces need a constant military presence. Therefore, they need magistrates with imperium to run them. They can't just elect more consuls. That would diminish the prestige of the office. And if you haven't been paying attention, prestige is literally the only thing high-class Romans care about. So Rome makes a new office, the praetor. They have imperium, but they're beneath the consuls. They go in the cursus honorum, so you have to be praetor before consul. It works as designed in the years between the First and Second Punic Wars. There are two praetors and two consuls. Praetors run the less important provinces and are basically guaranteed a consulship a few years later. But with the addition of Spain and North Africa, Rome needs more magistrates again, so they start electing more praetors, 4 or 6 per year instead of 2. This is dangerous. Now every consular election, there will be a lot of former praetors running. Some of them will never reach the consulship, and frustrated oligarchs are known to resort to violence. And even 6 praetors isn't enough. The Senate starts to use prorogation. A consul or praetor after his year in office will be granted a few more years as proconsul or propraetor in his province. The proconsul or propraetor has imperium in that province, but nowhere else. Extending imperium past the 1-year term limit contradicts one of the central tenets of the Roman Republic, but the old Republic system just isn't suited to running an overseas empire. In Spain, true Roman imperialism takes shape. Previously, Rome's subjugation of conquered people mostly only extended to matters of war. But Spain is full of mines, and Roman magistrates quickly realize how much money they can make by taking over this mining for themselves. Soon Rome is fighting extra wars to expand into other regions in Spain to get more mines, and treating the native populations horrifically while doing so. Economic exploitation in Spain leads Roman oligarchs to realize how much they've been missing out everywhere else. Cue Rome's increasing involvement in the Greek world. In the late 3rd century BCE, Greece is being ruled by a Macedonian king named Philip V, part of a dynasty established by the Macedonian Alexander the Great. Rome gets into a series of wars with Philip V on the heels of the Punic Wars. In 197, Rome wins a decisive victory in the Second Macedonian War, establishing Roman dominance over the Greek world. They could add Greece as a province, but this is only 4 years after they added Spain and North Africa. They don't want to further jeopardize their political system, so they don't annex Greece. Wow, look at that! Rome shows restraint and doesn't annex land based on sound logical reasoning. They resist further overreach. Don't worry, it won't last long. The Roman oligarchy grows dependent on extracting wealth from the provinces. It starts with a few magistrates who get outrageously wealthy from the mining operations in Spain. Plenty of other magistrates follow their lead in their own provinces. Now there's a lot of money flying around at election time. Upper-class Romans who haven't made a ton of money out of provinces have to go into massive debt just to compete for office. Then, if they win, they're going to need to use their offices to gain a lot of money to pay off those debts. It's a circular system. You need money to get into office. Then you need to get a lot of money from your office to make it all worth it. This machine turns its attention on Greece, which is one of the wealthiest regions in the world in this period. At the end of the Third Macedonian War in 168 BCE, Rome adds Greece as a province and imposes tributa, Roman taxes. Sidebar on tax collecting in ancient Roman provinces. The Romans loved conquering and hated establishing bureaucracies. Collecting taxes requires a lot of organization, and the Roman state is far too involved in its own internal policies to worry with that kind of detail in its provinces. So the Senate uses contractors called publicani, who collect tribute in a practice called tax farming. The Senate would accept bids from these independent contractors for collecting the taxes from a certain area for a certain number of years. Whoever's bid was accepted would pay that money to the Senate immediately from his own wealth, and then go to the province and collect money from the residents. Whatever money he collects over his bid is his profit. He is not a representative of the state, so he is not accountable to anybody. Not government, but not quite private citizen either, because the Roman military in the province will support his efforts. The opportunities for abuse are obvious. There's a reason that tax collectors are hated figures in the New Testament of the Bible, which takes place in the Roman province of Judea. In 146 BCE, Rome destroys both Carthage and Corinth, two of the largest and wealthiest cities in the Mediterranean. This is not a state willing to compete for dominance anymore. This is an imperial power, willing and able to destroy its competition and exploit outlying land for itself. But it is doing so using a political system held together with popsicle sticks and tape. The exponential growth of Rome through the 2nd century BCE put stresses on this system that are too great to bear. Back in the city of Rome, all this new wealth flowing from the provinces into the pockets of the oligarchy is changing the culture. The Romans call it Hellenization. Rome is being influenced by Greece. In case you don't know this, a more precise term for Greek, at least in this era, is Hellenic. Hellenization means Greek influence. The stereotype of early Republican Rome is the austere soldier farmer, Brutus and Cincinnatus and Camillus, at home both behind a plow and in front of an army. Wealthy Greeks of this time live in a lot more luxury, and now magistrates are coming back from Greece, having spent a lot of time with the Greek upper classes, bringing back Greek wealth, enslaved Greeks, and new ideas. The now fabulously wealthy Roman elites begin to flaunt their wealth. Nice chariots, flashy jewelry for their wives, huge dinner parties with expensive food and wine. A poster child for this new Hellenized upper class is Scipio Africanus, the general who defeated Hannibal. But there is also a segment of the nobility who reacts with horror to the Hellenized elite, and its poster child is Cato the Elder, the Carthago delenda-esque guy. Cato argues forcefully for the mos maiorum, which is Latin for the custom of the ancestors. Cato famously lives frugally, spending no more than he must, eating cabbage and wearing simple togas with no tunic underneath. Cato wants the rest of the nobility to live like he does, but he loses the culture war. Noblemen with new access to unimaginable wealth aren't going to live like poor farmers just because their grandfathers did. But all that provincial wealth does a lot more than just change how rich people live. Rome's exploitation of the provinces greatly increases the number of enslaved people. Slavery has been a part of Roman life since the beginning. But since people are largely enslaved after being taken as prisoners of war, more wars means more enslaved people. And all that wealth flowing into the upper class means that wealthy senators and equestrians are buying up more land. Sidebar on equestrians. Equestrians are the rich people of Rome who don't hold public office. Senators are the upper echelon socially because they have political power. Equestrians are the merchants, bankers, publicani, and other moneymakers. People often think of equestrians as the middle class, and senators as the upper class, and that's true as long as you realize that class is not synonymous with money. Senators aren't necessarily richer. In fact, a great many equestrians are much richer than any senators. The difference is that senators hold both wealth and political power, and equestrians hold only wealth. Anyway, senators and equestrians are buying land, and they're using massive numbers of enslaved people to farm it. Their operating costs are lower, both because of volume and because they're forcing people to work for them without paying them. So they can afford to sell what they produce for much less than small-time farmers working their own plots. Small-time farmers are largely squeezed out of business and forced to sell their land to senators and equestrians. The dwindling of the small-time farmer has huge implications. First, remember the Roman ideal of the soldier farmer. It's more than just the mos maiorum, it's a requirement. Only landowners are allowed to serve in the army. It's so that they'll have a real stake in the decisions made by the Senate and magistrates. They're fighting to preserve their land back home. All these farmers losing their land means fewer Roman soldiers, which leads the Roman army to rely more and more heavily on their Italian allies for troops. As these smaller Italian peoples provide more soldiers, they start to protest. They're not Roman citizens. They're sending their men off to fight, but they have no say in these wars. They don't vote for the consuls who lead their troops. The rest of Italy starts to agitate for Roman citizenship, but the Senate won't hear of it. They believe forcefully that Romans, the conquerors, are something special and apart, and they can't go adding just anybody to their oligarchy. This question of citizenship for Italian allies will become one of the biggest controversial issues of the century and lead to a war, but I'll get to that in another video. Meanwhile, the streets of Rome are filling up with former soldier farmers who have lost their land. The population of the city skyrockets, far higher than the demand for workers in a pre-industrial city. The nobility has replaced free farmers with enslaved ones, and given the former farmers nothing to do. There is now a massive population of urban poor. Rome is ripe for a new conflict of the orders. Remember that the original conflict of the orders pitted the patricians against the plebeians. Thanks to the efforts of the tribunes of the plebs, the voice of the common people, plebeians are now part of the oligarchy, but not all plebeians. Wealth and power are still heavily hereditary. A handful of plebeian families have become powerful and joined the patricians. It's a new nobility, and it's still extremely restrictive and non-democratic. It is no longer impossible for new families to break into the nobility, but it is still insanely difficult. And the tribunes of the plebs are no longer the voice of the common people. Tribunes are ambitious members of the oligarchy, and the tribunate is a stepping stone to higher offices. It is no longer in a tribune's interest to disrupt the status quo. But that changes when a young nobleman named Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus becomes tribune in 133. Tiberius Gracchus is not one of the common people. He is a plebeian. You have to be to get elected tribune, but his family is firmly aristocratic. His grandfather is Scipio Africanus, the Hellenized nobleman who defeated Hannibal. But Tiberius Gracchus sees the problems of his day, the extreme wealth inequality that has created an incredibly rich nobility and a restless crowd of urban poor who can no longer make a living. He also sees the political advantage of those restless crowds. He takes on the old style of tribune of the plebs and proposes laws specifically to benefit the urban poor. The biggest thing he proposes is actually enforcing a law that already exists. A lot of rich Romans own more public land than they're legally allowed to have. Tiberius Gracchus proposes seizing that land and distributing it to the urban poor, turning them back into farmers. It's a win-win because it will get these poor people off the streets and make them eligible for military service again, strengthening Rome's army and lessening its need for troops from the rest of Italy. Of course, the Senate hates the idea, because they're the only ones who don't personally benefit from it. To get his proposals passed, Tiberius Gracchus whips up the passions of the people, hoping the Senate can't resist a huge mob of angry voters. The Senate accuses him of using emotional appeals to the people just to increase his own political power, which is probably true, even if his proposals were a good idea. That's the thing about Romans. Even when they're right, they're also thinking about their own personal clout. It's in their culture. Tiberius Gracchus marks the arrival of a new style of politics. Instead of working through the traditional oligarchy and rallying support among senators, he rallies his support among the masses of individual voters. Politicians who court the favor of the masses come to be known as populares. The opposite of populares are called optimates. These are oligarchs who work through the traditional system and favor those who already have political power. The privileged few of the optimates have a lot more power than the masses of common people, so there is always a whiff of the threat of violence about Tiberius Gracchus's mobs of plebeians. This is another callback to the conflict of the orders. When the people are not given political power, they resort to mob violence to get what they want. But oddly, when the violence begins, it's the optimates who start it. When Tiberius Gracchus runs for re-election as tribune at the end of 133, the optimates cry foul. It is unprecedented to run for immediate re-election, to be fair, and Gracchus probably shouldn't have tried it. But what the optimates do is worse. They gather a mob of supporters and attack Tiberius Gracchus and his supporters in the forum with wooden clubs. They beat 200 or 300 people to death, including Tiberius Gracchus himself. A decade later, in 123 BCE, we get the second Gracchus. Tiberius's brother, Gaius Sempronius Gracchus, is elected tribune of the plebs. By most accounts, Tiberius Gracchus was careful and deliberate, where younger brother Gaius is energetic and flamboyant. Gaius Gracchus is even more controversial than his brother, bringing back demands for land reform and also promoting citizenship for the Italian allies and promising the common people a subsidized grain distribution. Grain is the staple of the Roman diet, and most common people live on a sort of porridge. But price fluctuation is a big problem. Grain might be plentiful and affordable one month, but a shortage could cause it to be incredibly expensive the next. To alleviate this problem for the poor, Gaius Gracchus proposes that the state buy up surplus grain when it is plentiful and store it, so that the state can always sell every citizen a certain amount of grain for a fixed price. It's not free food, that comes later in Roman history. It's a way of stabilizing the price. But it does require a lot of infrastructure and bureaucracy, and you know how the Roman nobility hates that. The optimates don't want to put in a lot of labor and expense on behalf of the poor, whom they consider not their problem, and they certainly don't like anyone threatening their gigantic mega-farms or Roman supremacy in politics. They've gotten murdery to prevent a slight reduction of their personal wealth before, and they're willing to do it again. But Gaius Gracchus has learned from his brother's murder. He surrounds himself with bodyguards and prepares his mobs of supporters for possible violence. So the optimates bide their time. Gaius Gracchus spends 2 years as tribune and does pass his laws, though the Senate and other magistrates slow down the actual enforcement of land reform. In 121, through sneaky political efforts by the optimates, many of Gracchus's supporters move to other candidates, and he fails to be re-elected again. At this point, Gracchus's mobs riot. The Senate passes an unprecedented measure called the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, which means final decree of the Senate. The SCU authorizes the consul to do anything necessary to guarantee the safety of the state. Normally, a consul can't just lead an army against a group of Roman citizens, but the SCU suspends the rights of individuals. It allows the consul to declare open warfare on Gracchus's mobs and end the riots through force. Despite the name, this will not be the final Senatus Consultum Ultimum. It will be used several times throughout the civil wars of the following century. Gaius Gracchus and his makeshift army fight an actual Roman army for a few days, but it is quickly apparent that they cannot win. Gracchus kills himself. In Roman thought, suicide is considered an honorable end for a general who has been defeated in battle, because it is dishonorable to be taken alive. In Gracchus's case, he also wants to spare his supporters further violence. In that, he is unsuccessful. The Senate hunts down and executes huge numbers of Gracchus supporters after the fighting is over. Between the actual fighting and the executions afterward, something like 3,000 die. The Gracchi are ultimately unsuccessful in the reforms they try to enact, but their style of courting the masses becomes a common political tactic. After the Gracchi come many popularis politicians who cater to the needs of the common people to gain political power, and many optimates dedicated to preserving the traditional dominance of the oligarchy. The era of the Gracchi also normalizes mob violence in politics. It should be noted that although the Gracchi get the blame for this, it was the optimates who drew first blood. But whoever gets the blame, politics as blood sport is not a healthy way to run a state. Civil war is on the horizon. So, to review. Rome adds a lot of new land, putting stresses on its political system, which must add new officeholders to govern it all. They also begin to exploit their provinces economically, infusing huge amounts of wealth into the nobility. This causes internal issues. Hellenization changes the lifestyles of the upper class, and widening wealth inequality disenfranchises the smallholding farmers who used to form the backbone of Rome. All this leads to a new conflict between the ruling oligarchy and the common people, between optimates and populares, a sort of second conflict of the orders that crystallizes in a pair of brothers called the Gracchi. In response to the Gracchi, the oligarchy injects an unprecedented level of violence into politics, escalating political disputes into mob warfare in the streets of Rome. So how do we get from mob violence to civil war, from dysfunctional republic to autocracy? In the next video, we take a few more steps toward the end, with the rise of the warlords.